Before I kick off today, quick plug for something I'm doing at the moment, the Max Holloway Master Study Series. First episode dropped on the Patreon on Thursday. Several thousand words and drawings and diagrams on back kicks, how to land them, the 3 ideal scenarios. Or the 3 scenarios where they're actually not disastrous. The setups, all that other good stuff. The fact that he hasn't just learned it in the last couple of fights, as DC said. But yeah, go join the Patreon, read that. It should explain why in this episode I accidentally mentioned Max Holloway a whole bunch. Sort of my whole life at the moment. Cheers. Oi oi, it's your boy. The Craig Jones Invitational of headlines that are sensational. Jack Slack. It's the Jack Slack podcast. We're coming at you on Monday the 27th of May. And you might be wondering to yourself, oh, what did I miss this weekend? And the answer is very little. Not a lot going on in combat sports over the weekend, I'm afraid. There was a boxing match between Josh Taylor and Jack Catterall. Previously, they'd had a close-fought fight that went split decision. A lot of people thought Catterall deserved it. Taylor got the nod by split. Oh, it might have been a majority decision. No, it was a split decision. But it was the start of the obvious Josh Taylor decline. He had some injury stuff. I think it might have been a shoulder or something like that. But basically, he fights Jose Ramirez in May 2021. Doesn't come back until February 2022 for the first Jack Catterall fight. Scrapes the decision. Fights Teofimo Lopez, gets outclassed in June 2023, and then comes back May 2024 for this fight. Jesus, was it already a year since that Teofimo Lopez fight? That's crazy. I mean, we talked about this. Like, this division is guys having the performance of their life, and then and you go, wow, pound for pound superstar born here, and then they turn up and look terrible in the next one. Teofimo Lopez is the perfect example of that. Beats Lomachenko, looks terrible against Kambosos. Everyone writes him off, comes back and embarrasses Josh Taylor, and then looks terrible in his last one against Jermaine Ortiz. But Josh Taylor is definitely on the decline, and Jack Catterall really looked good in this fight, I thought. It was still close and competitive, and Bob Arum went off on the decision, but most people think the right person won. It's just that this is quite a hard sort of fall from grace that Josh Taylor's having, because we're in an era now where I think it's sports science and nutrition and rehab and prehab and all the other stuff that has advanced so far since the old days. Guys can keep going until they're 40, like Manny Pacquiao, beating Keith Thurman at like 41 years old, and doing it at welterweight where he is still quite a small man. But other people do just have these massive drop-offs. And I think with Josh Taylor, that's really the case. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, Josh Taylor was in the middle of the Ring Magazine pound-for-pound top 10. Very highly regarded. And he just seems to have really lost a step. This was an interesting one, though, because it was 2 southpaws matched up. And, no matter who you are, you will meet southpaws. Particularly if you have an extended amateur career, you will meet a lot of southpaws. But you will always meet more orthodox fighters than you meet southpaws. So most southpaws have a specialism in beating orthodox fighters, and most orthodox fighters also have a specialism in beating orthodox fighters. So they're always at a little bit of a disadvantage, or most often at a little bit of a disadvantage. You get the odd freak who's really just very good at fighting southpaws, like an orthodox fighter who's just very good at fighting southpaws. I mean, an MMA example would be like Chris Weidman fought 8 southpaws back-to-back in the top 10 of the division. It was really weird. Paulo Costa in MMA looks much better against southpaws than he does orthodox fighters because he can throw his right body kick freely. But back to boxing. But yeah, it was really interesting. And Jack Catterall's jab looked sensational against Josh Taylor because jabbing orthodox versus southpaw is different to jabbing southpaw versus southpaw, which is like jabbing orthodox versus orthodox. So Catterall really outclassed him there. And yeah, it was just a good, fun fight is how I describe it. On a weekend where not much happened except influencer boxing, which I'm not going to talk about because I didn't watch. It was good fun. And then the other thing that happened this weekend that is definitely worth a watch is that my boy, Harry Hardwick, won the Cage Warriors featherweight title. Obviously a title with some great storied history. Conor McGregor, Paddy Pimblett, Paul Hughes, who's just signed a very lucrative contract, well, allegedly, with PFL. Guys who are going to the next level tend to win that belt. And I think, does George Hardwick have the lightweight belt still over there? Hold on. Because I believe that Graham Boylan, in addition to insisting on being the manager of these fighters when they leave Cage Warriors and go to the UFC, I believe he also stripped George Hardwick of the title before he fought on Contender Series. So even though George didn't get the contract with the UFC, he still doesn't have the title when he goes back to Cage Warriors. Oh no, he's champion again. Oh, and since 2022. So someone just told me that in the gym as a rumour. Cheeky bastard. But we all know George Hardwick now. Bangs the body. One of the best body shots with his hands in MMA. Has this little left hand. His elbow sort of stays on his body. Probably the best use of the term shovel hook, which is a nebulous term that people just bring out to like smell their own farts most of the time. But he has his elbow like right tight to his body and he just digs it to their solar plexus or liver. Fantastic fighter. Fantastic body shot. Harry throws to the body, but switch hits. And I like both the Hardwick boys I have for a long time. I don't know how long ago it was, but they've been around my Facebook and, commenting on articles and things forever, since they were like putting up photos going, oh, hitting pads in Mum's back garden or whatever. So it's really nice to see them both with world titles or Cage Warriors world titles. I think both of them deserve a shot in the UFC, but the way that you have to do it is go through the Contender Series, and sometimes the people you're against surprise you. Or at least I'd like to see them go, the PFL route or whatever. But that brings us on to something I wanted to chat about today. Basically, today is going to be promotion drama. We could talk about John Jones possibly being gay, but Rampage is out there going like, some stuff's about to come out about him that'll really shock UFC fans. And I'm like, almost nothing. Unless you know about a murder, Rampage, and they're about to get the warrant to search his house. One of his 2 mansions in Albuquerque. But the real stuff this week, drama-wise, PFL, man, that stuff is... When they bought Bellator, we all went, damn, that's interesting. When they got Francis, we went, damn, that's interesting. And now it looks like Francis, because of the loophole in his contract, or because of the leeway they gave him in his contract to box as much as he wants, of course he's going to box, because there's way more money on the table. I know people think that he's done because he lost to like one of the top 3 heavyweights in the world right now, but he could have a fight with, I don't know, Derek Chisora. He keeps fucking popping back up. I thought he was retiring. But he could have a fight with any one of those big boys who's not Joshua, Fury or Usyk, and people would pay attention. And he would still make tons of money. If he could get the Wilder fight, I mean, Wilder's fighting this weekend against Zhang, or Zhang Gilei, but if he could get the Wilder fight, that'd be great, because at least, Francis is pretty bloody fearless and can take a terrific shot. But yes, back to PFL. They bought Bellator and we went, oh, that's exciting. And then they didn't actually merge the brands, and that seems like a massive mistake. But in buying Bellator, they bought up a lot of contracts that it seems like now they don't want to honour. And this is going to be an interesting one because it's Gegard Mousasi's been one of the most outspoken, and Cyborg too, but Gegard Mousasi's been outspoken about it and went on the MMA Hour, and I actually went and watched that interview, which was quite interesting. Quite sadly, only 25,000 views on the YouTube clip of that interview. People still do not care about MMA outside the UFC mostly, but then that's part of the problem we'll talk about in a second. But Scott Coker gave pretty lucrative contracts to his guys, allegedly, but then we saw the details of Patricio Pitbull's pay when he fought, might have been the first AJ McKee fight, but they went somewhere where the purses were released, and a lot of it was like people going, I expected more for Pitbull, who is their 2-division champion, probably the most successful and best fighter to be just like a Bellator home fighter. Homegrown talent, that's what I was looking for. But they'd always put Mousasi on a pedestal. I mean, Scott Coker liked him from back in the Strikeforce days. He went Strikeforce, then he came to the UFC, I believe when the UFC bought Strikeforce, and then he went back to Bellator after leaving the UFC. And he left on a winning streak in the UFC middleweight division because he wanted more money, presumably, or because he wanted something different when his contract expired. I joke around about Mousasi a lot on this podcast because he is still, I think someone said the other day on Twitter, I thought it was a really good phrase, the most overrated, underrated fighter of all time. And he is in that sense. There are a lot of people who follow MMA who still don't know who he is, and that's a bit of an oversight because he was very, very good. But the people who love him still love to say things like, he beat Mark Hunt and Gary Goodridge, real heavyweights. And it's like Mark Hunt was something like 3 and 5 in MMA at the time and was on meth all the time. He was fighting for meth money and was just a kickboxer. He didn't know how to deal with anything. It was a real revolution that Mark Hunt, because this is another promotional thing. Mark Hunt had this contract that was bought up during the Pride tenure, and the UFC were like, but we don't want him. He's useless. And then he really put in the work. And when he turned up in the UFC, he was suddenly getting much better in a way that he hadn't in Pride. In Pride, he was just like, oh, I'm going to swang and bang. Oh, no, I've fallen over. I lasted surprisingly long on the ground against Fedor, but he was never very good. It was a real renaissance he had in the UFC when they didn't want to give him it, which is part of why there's always been this beef between the UFC and Mark Hunt. But there's more to it than that, obviously, the Brock Lesnar stuff. But then the Mousasi win over Gary Goodridge. I mean, Gary Goodridge, he'd spent like the last 5 years being just knocked out over and over again in K1 and Pride. He wasn't very good to begin with. And Mousasi immediately came out and took him down. And he's, it's sad because Gary Goodridge is on Twitter being a nice guy all the time. And just like he's dealing with the effects of really bad CTE because of Japanese matchmakers who just loved watching him get knocked out in K1, even though he was not a kickboxer. He had no kickboxing experience. Or like the Jacare win. They always go on about that, about Mousasi. Yeah, he upkicked him. That was cool. But then the moment that Jacare learned to be a bit more patient, they had a rematch in the UFC, and Jacare just absolutely dominated him. It was an upkick while Jacare was on his feet, so it's not even the case that you could be like, well, he couldn't do that in the UFC. He absolutely could. It's just that Jacare didn't leave his face hanging out there standing over Mousasi. He just dominated him. And Lyoto Machida dominated him in the UFC. They waited 10 years for the rematch in Bellator to give Mousasi a win, and Mousasi barely got the split decision by the judges not knowing what they were watching. He lost to Shlemenko, who was a welterweight, and they gave him the decision. So no, he was at no point like an all-time great middleweight. He's just a very good middleweight that you should probably know about, who had an interesting career. However, he's fought a lot of places, and he said in this interview that PFL is the worst organisation he's ever had to deal with. The interview is gold because Ariel Helwani, I think he knows. I think he's just being a cheeky chappy. Oh, and by the way, I do like Musasi's interviews. He interviews well. He's a funny lad. But Ariel keeps going like, he lets Mousasi get going on a head of steam, and he goes, but have you spoken to Mike Kogan? Surely Mike Kogan would stand for this. And Mike Kogan is a clown. He used to be he used to manage fighters. He got Nate Diaz. Do you remember when Nate Diaz was like headlining cards and he was on a 20 and 20 contract? And he had something like 16 fights in the UFC, and people were going, how the hell did that happen? It was Mike Kogan got that for him. Mike Kogan also famously tweeted the N-word a few times. But he ended up, like everyone in Scott Coker's orbit does, failing upwards. He ended up as like VP of talent relations in Bellator. So his job is to go out there and be like, look, Usman Nurmagomedov failed a drug test, but it was for something that didn't matter. Yes, the no contest still stands. No, we're not telling you what the drug was. Let's all just move on with our lives. Brent Primus will get his rematch anyway. And then, no, Brent Primus doesn't get his rematch. We're all moving on with the tournament. It's my favourite thing to tweet at Don Davis. If he's tweeting bollocks, as he was this week, just reply, but what drug did Usman Nurmagomedov take? So anyway, Mousasi says he can't get fights. That's the summary of this. He can't get fights. Cyborg can't get fights. Two big names from Bellator. So when they bought the Bellator brand and they asked for like the names to be included or to take the contracts, that's who they were getting. Because, I mean, what were you getting from the brand? And the crazy thing is that they're still using the brand. They're not just like PFL involved. The whole thing was the good thing about Bellator is the roster. They scouted some very good fighters. I've always said, like, the UFC has 90 to 95% of the best fighters in the world. The rest are in Bellator. PFL has a very interesting structure. It has some cool ideas. It allegedly had a ton of funding behind it, and it had an ESPN deal. So that was all like, that's what you want. Get some good fighters over there for that. Because Bellator are just were previously just incapable of marketing anything. And the PFL decided to keep Bellator separate and then also not include many of Bellator's top fighters. So that's crazy. Douglas Lima says he can't get fights either. And I think the interesting thing was that Mousasi was saying that he'd spoken to loads of fighters and asked them like what their rough pay was. He said that a lot of people were getting the same sort of pay as him and he couldn't get fights and some of them couldn't get fights. It's a really interesting interview. Go listen to it. I mean, he's a very eloquent man for speaking in his second or third language or whatever. Get that tinge of shame that I always get when I go to a European country and they're happy to just converse with you in English. And I'm like, I've got this phrase book. I was going to try some of your language. Or you're holding up Google Translate on your phone to try to work out where the hotel is. But the upshot of all of that is that PFL asked Ariel Helwani to read their side of the story on the episode while the interview was going on. Musasi's saying like he can't get a hold of, his management can't get a hold of anyone at PFL. And then the moment that they hear he's going on Ariel Helwani's show, they're like, we've got our rebuttal. And then a day, 2 days later, PFL on their social media account put PFL/Bellator official fighter roster update. So I don't know if they even decided whether he was going to PFL or just staying in Bellator. But fighter roster update, May 23rd, 2024. Bellator has released Gegard Mousasi from his agreement. We wish him all the best in his next fighting chapter. Mike Kogan, clown, head fighter operations. And Don Davis, the same day, went on fucking John McCarthy and Josh Thompson's podcast. Why would you do that? Occasionally we'll have a fighter grumble, Davis said on the Weighing In podcast with John McCarthy and... Sorry, drifted off there. It's one of 205 fighters we've acquired from Bellator. You expect 5 to 10% issues on any deal. You can't be perfect. You can be with 90 to 95%. We've had a handful of people say, oh, I wish it was this way. I wish it went that way. I'm delighted. I'm very proud. I'm very, very proud of how we treated our fighters, how we treat our employees. Most of all, the product. We just completed our second Bellator show in Paris, which was awesome. We didn't sit on this for 6 months. We didn't take a year off. We didn't lay off 100 fighters. All the stuff that always happens in acquisitions. So I just could not be more proud. We're direct, fair, and reasonable, 100%. I mean, you didn't lay off any fighters, but you're also not paying them by not giving them fights, allegedly. It is kind of like, you know, putting on my promoter hat. Once I get past the memory of the prostitute I murdered last night, I can look at this and say, well, probably because of their position in the Bellator company, Gegard Mousasi and Douglas Lima were paid quite a lot. Gegard Mousasi is on the downward slope, and you know, aside from like nerds who love this shit, doesn't attract a lot of attention. Is he worth anything more than a lot of the other headliners? It's questionable. Douglas Lima hasn't had a good fight since he knocked out MVP in 2019. He's actually had the opposite of good fights. He is in very much a Tyron Woodley spiral. He backs himself onto the cage and throws no strikes. If you've watched any of his last 5 fights, they've been utterly terrible. So if he's paid a lot of money, I would also want to keep him on the bench. Promoter hat off. A lot of people are speculating that this means the PFLs are running out of money. We've always assumed that because they're, you know, nebulously backed by Saudi interests, they would have a lot of money. But anytime you're not booking fighters, that's sus. One is doing this currently. You know, the people who claim to have infinite money and definitely aren't $500 million in the hole, they have always like displayed this incredible opulence in their events and their production values and so on. But there are many, many fighters there who are complaining that they don't get fights. And for a while, people were taking down Facebook posts about not getting a fight because they were getting threatened with legal action. And you do notice people like Regian Ursel, they had him win 2 sports, belts in 2 sports, Muay Thai and kickboxing. And he didn't fight for a year. They got Chingiz Alazov, the best kickboxer in the world, pound for pound. Hasn't fought for like a year. Their MMA is like dead in the water. It's just there so that it can appear in their investor prospectus that they're an MMA company. So it's not a good place to be if you're not the UFC right now. And they just won that lawsuit too. So, well, not won that lawsuit, but settled that lawsuit. So they have to give a few $1,000s that would never really hurt them to fighters who previously fought for them. Mousasi was actually saying that on this interview. He was saying, I've got that payout to look forward to. But yes, combat sports are in a great phase at the moment, and stuff outside the UFC is fun to watch. And there are a lot of fighters who aren't in the UFC who are doing fun things. But the situation is still that nobody seems to be able to make money doing this. Or at least not spend themselves into oblivion. Bolivian. Another interesting promoter story of this week. Abu Dhabi Combat Club, ADCC, is the World Cup of grappling. And it has been since it was... Wait, when did... Hang on, I'm going to have to check this. I know it was like the late 90s. Yeah, 1998. Some sheikh, son of the president of the UAE, been getting jiu-jitsu lessons, says, I want to do a real world championship that's not the Mundials and not in the gi. They get it together, it becomes a huge event, Happens every 2 years, which I think is magic. They were talking about doing it every year now, but I think the every 2 years thing is fantastic. And while Jiu-Jitsu in the gi and the IBJJF no gi worlds, they didn't allow like neck cranks and they didn't allow heel hooks and things, ADCC said that's all on the table. This isn't a Brazilian jiu-jitsu competition. This is a grappling competition. So people have turned up, from other grappling arts, and they've done well in it. Sinai Kikuta, judoka, won gold at 88 kilos in 2001. Josh Barnett, Mark Kerr did well in it. Mark Kerr won 3 golds. Theon Davis, judoka, who then transitioned to jiu-jitsu and no-gi grappling. There's loads of interesting stories in ADCC, but it's open. You go to the qualifiers. You don't have to have a card that says you do BJJ. Anytime someone's saying like Sambo's a superior grappling art or something like that, it's like, I don't care, but they can enter this. They can do just this grappling contest for the best grapplers on earth, which does pretty heavily favor wrestling. It's not like pulling guard gives you advantages in ADCC. But the issue is the prize money's always been shit. And it's funded by a sheikh, and they get these arenas. They had a big empty arena in China one year. They take it all over the world, and the pay is still dreadful. So Craig Jones, cheeky scamp that he is, has hooked himself up with some kind of investor, and he's doing, well, they've jokingly called it BDCC because him and his team are the B team because they split off from Danaher's crew, and they win silver medals instead of golds. But after allegedly being threatened with legal action, they changed it to the Craig Jones Invitational, and there is a $1 million prize for the winner. They're doing an under 88 kilos division, which is a strong division in ADCC, and they're doing a women's, not sure what it is, but already the Tackett brothers and Theon Davis have left ADCC because they're doing it on the same day, which is, obviously a smack in the face, but that's the point. They're trying to get some money for the grapplers, or to send a message getting money to the grapplers. The interesting thing is that to get to ADCC, you have to be invited, which normally involves being a medalist the previous year, or you have to win your way there through the trials, which can have like 100 people in your division, and you have to take 4, 5, 6 matches to even get there against killers. So it's very interesting that the Tackett brothers earned their way in, and Andrew Tackett had a storming time at the ADCC trials. He was the star of the show, and they both said, no, $1 million is life-changing money. I'd rather go do that, thanks. And then Theon Davis is a really interesting one because she won gold the previous in the last ADCC. So you're losing your reigning champion to this upstart organization. I say organization, it might be one event, but it's certainly going to make a point. So that's very interesting. The problem with this is kind of like the problem with any MMA org opening up and going like, we will give huge amounts of money if you come and fight with us. You are competing against a bigger organization, and you're having to offer bigger prizes to draw people away. And of course, ADCC were able to immediately beg Gordon Ryan to announce that he's definitely competing because Gordon Ryan is the big star in grappling. There is no one else people are interested in watching aside from Gordon. He has managed to exceed this little niche sport. Transcend, that's the one, not exceed. Anyway, that's what's going on in nerdy business shit. Let's do a couple of questions because it's been a while since I've dipped into the old mailbag. Dear Mr. Slacky J, I've just finished watching a great video on why the style of British boxing died. It talks about the history of British boxing and the revival of sorts through the use of stance switching like Prince Nazim and Tyson Fury. All this talk of stance switching reminded me of your love for switch hitters, and so I ask you, does your love for switch hitters come from watching switch hitters growing up? I love your podcast and when you decide to upload to YouTube, and have found it quite insightful on the finer details of mixed martial arts and boxing. Enjoy the rest of your day. Kind regards, Quinn. The switch hitting style of boxing and the British style of boxing, traditionally, there was a bit of a cross-Atlantic war between British boxers and American boxers back in the time of people like Jimmy Wilde, Frank Klaus. Basically, infighting caught on in America. Britain was still producing these sort of like upright, classical, jab-centric boxers. And not jabs, they'd call them a jolt, or they'd call them a lead or a jolt. Jim Driscoll, great example. I mean, Jim Driscoll and Jimmy Wilde, I'm using examples because they wrote books about it. And Frank Klaus wrote a book about it from the American perspective, where he was like, this is how I'd get inside on a British boxer. And Jimmy Wilde wrote, and Jim Driscoll wrote these books like, well, a British boxer would never succumb to the foolish infighting. It would simply be impossible to get past my jab. And then they were big on clinching too. So yes, it was this upright style. It was led with the lead hand, not jabbing, the lead left. Big focus on stepping on your jab, as in left foot moves forward on the jab and your weight falls into it. You're really trying to blast the guy through the head with it. You're not back fisting it. You're not flicking it out like Ali. Big regard of the right cross or the right straight coming across the top. Clinching is important. A lot of those boxers from that era, and a lot of this I'm getting from Welsh boxers. It's like when the best tennis player in Britain was Scottish. You're Scottish when we don't like you. You're British when you're important to our winning record. But big focus on the rear foot placement. If you read the books by Jim Driscoll and Jimmy Wilde, they're very big on using the rear foot to dictate range. They leave the lead foot where it is and they try and sway back out of range unless they're moving and trying to circle out. And American boxing was much more on getting on the inside, getting to the body, using the head to post and doing the traditional infighting, which has gone out of style in the modern era because obviously they hate clashes of heads, and you've got refs like Kenny Bayless, who I moan about every podcast. The left hook was much bigger in American boxing. And this is just a snapshot of a certain era. But when that cross-Atlantic rivalry was at its peak, this is what they were talking about regarding like styles. What you're talking about when you're talking about switch hitting, there is one gym in particular that produced switch hitters in the 90s and 2000s. That's Winkerbank Gym in Sheffield. Now it's the Ingle Boxing Gym. It used to be it was like a church house. He did boxing with the kids in like the evenings. But Brendan Ingle is the man, and he had a very interesting system, which I would love to learn. I'd actually love to go down. I don't know. It seems like they've got a website now. They never used to have that. But he worked with a guy called Harold Bomber Graham, who's considered like the best British fighter to never win a world title. In the 80s and 90s, he was terrific. And he fought, most famously, he lost a split decision to Mike McCullum, and he fought Julian Jackson, one of the biggest pound-for-pound hitters of all time. And he was looking sensational through 4 rounds. And just as the commentators are saying, it looks like he's running away with it here, he gets hit with an overhand and goes down, and it's the end. Like, they used to joke that he could snatch defeat from the jaws of victory because he was incredible. Chris Eubank said that you couldn't hit him with a handful of rice. And whenever people asked, like, did you duck him? He said, yeah, I ducked him. I'd get nothing out of fighting him, which I always thought was like the highest compliment you could pay someone. Just outright say, look, it does nothing for my brand to fight you. Why would I? You're a really hard fight. But Bomber Graham had this fantastic style where he switched from orthodox to southpaw and sometimes even stood square. If you watch some of his best performances when the guys are just like have no idea what to do with him, he's really something special. Lots of leaning back at the waist too, which of course is in modern boxing. I mean, I said earlier, like the Jimmy Wilde's, his books, he's all about putting the rear foot back and swaying back at the waist. But that really went out of fashion, and certainly boxing gyms, they like the pull counter, but they don't like you leaning back too much. If you're relying on it a lot, people will chase you down and hit you there. But Bomber Graham did a lot of that. And it's always been like contentious whether that was Bomber Graham brought that to Brendan Ingle and Brendan Ingle like took it and taught it as a style, or if Brendan Ingle came up with that. Ultimately, it doesn't matter because Brendan Ingle trained other people to do it. And he had this system where he had a load of lines and circles painted down the center of this old church house. And if you don't train there, you don't really know how they work, because he patented them in like the 90s, which is an interesting move, because either he could have done that just to like further his legend and make people intrigued, or he could genuinely have thought like he was going to roll it out and sell it to people. But there's been a few good switch hitters out there, like Junior Witter. Naz obviously was the big one. Kell Brook. Ryan Rhodes was a decent boxer out there. I don't know how Kid Galahad's doing nowadays. I remember having to write something about him just before he got his first loss. Oh man, looks like he had 2 losses in a row and he retired. But he fought Warrington for the IBF featherweight title. But anyway, yeah, there's been some good boxers out of that gym. They all had sort of a weird switch hitting style with various degrees of relying on the switch. Like I would say Kell Brook didn't switch as much as someone like Prince Nazim. Junior Witter probably switched a bit more than him. But Tyson Fury, I don't believe, has any sort of training link with that gym or that sort of like coaching legacy. He's just a guy who decided he wanted to be able to box on both sides. Because At the basic level, that's the choice you're making. You're saying, I think it'd be really valuable to be able to switch to southpaw. Or you're saying, I don't have time to incorporate that. I'd rather spend the time getting better on orthodox, on my single stance I do best. And it was really interesting watching back through Max Holloway's UFC career. He has a period where he's switch hit before he got to the UFC. He played with it. Doesn't do it much in his first couple of UFC fights. From February 2015 to December 2016, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 fights. He just fights southpaw. Doesn't really switch back much. Fights southpaw. And he really throws people for a loop. And then he gets his title fight against Jose Aldo and he goes back to orthodox. It's an insane thing that he did, and no one really talks about, because I covered all these fights as they were happening, and I just considered him a switch hitter. I didn't notice that for a period in the middle of his career, he is so intent on working on his southpaw stance that he brings it to every fight and insists that he stays southpaw for most of the fight. And since then, he's gone back to orthodox with a bit of switch hitting in. But it takes balls to just bring it out. Like, Tyson Fury does it occasionally. But where did I get so into switch hitting? That's the interesting question. Well, it's always just a given in karate circles, whether it's knockdown karate or point fighting styles. You just work both stances. So I already had that sort of influence on me. I was a big fan of the Winkerbag Gym and the boys from there. And I've always just been intrigued by the sidedness stuff in general. Like when I took up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I was interested in the fact that Marcelo Garcia, who was the GOAT at the time and probably still is, great work to him getting back on the mats and being declared 1 year cancer-free. Legend. But he laid out this thing about sidedness because you need to be able to do both sides in jiu-jitsu because the opponent, certainly playing guard, because the opponent dictates which leg they lead with. And he said, I don't have time to do that. I'm going to learn a different technique on both sides. You know, I've got one technique going this way, one technique going that way. And I thought that was fascinating. Then you got guys like Wade Chalez, the greatest pinner in amateur wrestling history, or at least American amateur wrestling history, said the first thing that he teaches everyone, like his kids and stuff, is when you're given the referee's position, so you're behind them and they're on all fours, and the referee starts you and the guy on the bottom tries to jump up or reverse, and you try and pin them, or mat return them as they stand. But he says the first thing that you can teach someone to improve their winning rate is to say, instead of starting on the usual side, go over to the other side that no one starts on. And it doesn't matter if you're only like 5 out of 10 on that side, the other guy's probably 3 out of 10 defending it because he never sees it. So there's always been that incredible value in being able to show the opponent something that they're not used to. And a huge amount of people work that out in combat sports. But the problem is always the shortcomings on the defensive end. If you stay in one stance the whole time, that's your base. You're absolutely safe. You know how to deal with things from there. You're less likely to get hit with dumb shots. And you're going to be safer most of the time anyway. If you switch to your less dominant stance, because you will always have a less dominant stance, you're going to be more hittable. And if you switch right in front of someone, the act of switching makes you very, very vulnerable. That's something you've always got to be really careful about with switch hitting. Don't do it directly in front of the guy unless you're confident he's covering up or moving back. Because if you get hit while switching, you're dead meat. Well, you're not dead meat, but you're almost guaranteed to fall over. And if you fall over from a punch in MMA and the other guy jumps on top of you and hits you with 3 shit hammer fists, there's a chance the ref stops it. But regarding boxing, I think it's very interesting because it was just not really done like 15 years ago. Guys didn't really switch hit much. And now, not just British boxers, not just Tyson Fury being a bit weird sometimes, Andre Ward made it a huge part of his game. He would just sneak in a bit of southpaw work mid-round. And sometimes he'd change mid-combination, as he did against Chad Dawson. And then, Terence Crawford, one of the top pound-for-pound guys in the world right now, just had the best performance of his career against one of the stiffest opponents of his career. He will genuinely come out for 3 rounds orthodox, and then in the 4th round, he'll go, right, I'm southpaw now. And then in round 8, he'll go back to orthodox, if it gets that far. He is remarkable for the fact that he keeps himself safe enough from both stances that he can basically just look for openings. And that's what the stance switching really does for you. You can play to your opponent. It's not what is my best technique I can land against them. It's what can they not deal with very well, and I'll switch my whole shit around to give it to them. Anyway, that was a good ramble about switch hitting. So yeah, I've always loved switch hitting. It's more prominent in traditional martial arts than combat sports, I would say. I mean, Muay Thai, has loads of switch hitters. So I've skipped over that entirely, but almost all really good Nagmoy can do a bit off southpaw because they kick and they either like advance or step back into southpaw, and then they have to work from there out of necessity. But a lot of guys are good at switching just to mix up the looks. And a great example would be Sam Art, who was one of the all-time greats in Muay Thai, but he fought Muay Thai predominantly orthodox. And then when he started focusing on boxing, where he became a world champion, he did it from southpaw. And boxing is a sport where guys train from so young on the same stuff over and over again. It is very much a sport where people think millions of repetitions, be very careful adding anything new. Most people will be absolutely shocked if you just decided one day, I'm going to train from southpaw for a couple of years. It'd be like, why are you doing that? You've put so much time into orthodox already. What are you doing? You're an idiot. You're going to get killed. Your orthodox skills will wither away due to lack of practice, and your southpaw skills will never get as good as your orthodox skills, so what's the point? It's overwhelmingly, stance switching is done well by creative fighters. You have to have that sort of like martial artsy, ooh, I'm expressing my body bullshit about you, but it is, yeah, it's that's why it's so cool. It marks you out as different, but it also allows you to look at the opponent and exploit stuff in them in that be water sort of way, as opposed to just hammering in the stuff you're good at and hoping that it eventually sticks. Oh, I've gone ages on that. Let's do a different question. Dear Jack, I've been an MMA fan for about 15 years, but have started watching boxing regularly in the last 2 years, partially due to your own recommendation of watching other combat sports to brighten up weekends of Apex slog. I noticed that the boxing community is quite cynical, and 2 years in, I can see why. In short, the very best very often do not fight the best in their prime. However, with Crawford, Japanese boxers such as Inoue and Nakatani, and of course Usyk, it seems like boxing is in a better place than before, but I lack the experience to really assess this. Would you say that boxing is having a bit of a renaissance? Thanks so much for the awesome work. Please keep up the Rajadamnern, he's making me say it, Rajadamnern World Series and Japanese kickboxing, and maybe a little bit of boxing coverage. Best, Thomas. I don't know how good a position I'm in for this, because when I was writing 3 articles a week at Fightland, I really was just on the MMA for quite a while. I keep an eye on like anyone super special in boxing, but it's only in the last couple of years that I've been trying to actually follow the boxing schedule. And if there's someone with one of those bullshit belts fighting, I check out what's going on. I look at their previous fights. I look at their opponent and their previous fights. I actually care, to do that. And having a podcast and not having to write 3 articles a week is giving me the luxury to do that. So I don't know if boxing's really having a renaissance or if I'm just joining in at a good, I'm joining in and making the best of the time. It's kind of like, what a time to be alive. This is the best time to be alive. And you don't really know because you didn't live 100 years ago. But it does, it's been pretty positive experience the last couple of years getting back into it. Just finding guys like Subriel Matias who just won 1 belt. And, previously I was looking at guys who were trying to unify belts. I was looking at guys, stuff that would register on the radar was much bigger. Whereas now I'm actually able to see interesting guys coming up and winning things. Those guys you mentioned, Crawford, Nakatani, Inoue, Usyk, all brilliant. It's been absolutely wonderful to watch them, and they are making waves. Certainly, like, Inoue is... I said last week that I can see he's caught on with the boxing world. I don't know what kind of star he is in Japan. And I had some Japanese listeners write in or comment and just say he's absolutely massive there. It's a huge thing when Inoue fights. Nakatani is obviously the new kid on the block in Japan compared to Inoue. And you've got Inoue's little brother as well. He's doing great stuff for himself. But he seems to be coming up real well too. But even a few years ago, like go back, Canelo was a huge... he's been like the biggest star in all sports, money-wise, for a while. That DAZN deal where he had like $1 million for every day of the year. He was on a $365 million deal. They did fall out over it, and DAZN came out and were like, well, we assumed that there would be some super fights in there. And someone asked, like, what do you mean by super fights? And they said, well, Jorge Masvidal or something. It's like, what the fuck are you doing promoting boxing? But the Gennady Golovkin stuff, this is the thing. Gennady Golovkin was super popular within the people who love watching people fight demographic, but his popularity was always under what it should have been for a guy who knocks out everyone. I definitely think that the heavyweight division's in a much better position than it was under the Klitschko's. People did get very bored of the Klitschko's, and it's sad because the Klitschko's were very, very good, and there just wasn't a heap of good fighters for them to fight. And of course, they weren't British or American. So that sort of limits what you can do as well. They were out there fighting in Germany. Germany fucking loved the Klitschko's, but it did help getting 2 British world champions, 1 American world champion, and having that, them dancing around each other, getting the belts reunited by Usyk. I mean, he's Ukrainian as well, so there's a question of whether interest drops off when it's Usyk versus, I don't know, that Croatian lad whose name I can never say. But the way that you see boxing fans talking about boxing, we do seem to be in a bit of a boom period. These things do get exaggerated. 5 years ago, it's like, this is why boxing's dying. People would say about every bad thing that happened in boxing. It is easy to be cynical and get really turned off by boxing because of all the extracurricular bollocks, I would call it. The fact that when there's a good fight between 2 good fighters and it's taken forever to put together, you know that there's going to be something fucky going on with the scoring. Someone's going to score it really obviously wrong. That is, kind of shit. That does sort of stick in your craw. The fact that the refs are often borderline incompetent. The fact that there's all these, all the politics to get good fights together, but they do seem to be happening more. And I think, this weekend we've got that Matchroom versus whatever the other one is, 5 versus 5. And I think that's a great little idea. Rather than my world champion's the best world champion, you should fight my world champion, but I won't let you fight my world champion. That's shit. Do it as like a team game. If you're doing your fighter versus their fighter on the regular, you both get a cut of the gate. I think that's a good idea for them to do going forward. I really like that. But I do think it has hurt boxing to be, that focus on the undefeated record. It's coming into MMA now, and it does suck. Because an undefeated record is impressive, but the more you do to make an undefeated record, the less impressive it is, and the more time you waste just building, quote unquote, this record so that they can then have 2 or 3 stiff opponents. And the great ones, they have that undefeated record and then they fight great fighters anyway. But it's just everyone has this lead time on their career. And some people Demetrius Andrade, we were talking about the other month, he just not really fought anyone. And then he finally fought someone good and lost, but he was getting kind of old. And it's like, well, could you have done better if you'd started fighting good fighters sooner? I don't know, real boxing heads in the comments, because this is like my MMA podcast where I also talk about fun stuff that's going on in wider combat sports. But this is definitely not a boxing podcast. So real boxing heads in the comments, let me know, are we enjoying the best period in a while? Or does it just feel like that to people like me and Thomas, who've been getting more into boxing over the last couple of years? Or getting back into boxing in my case. Cheers, Thomas. Dear Philosopher Jack, on Counter-Strikers who wait, you said movement feints and combos are the key way to deal with them. Brackets, Nicolau versus Perez. You didn't mention the double jab. Is everything okay? From Kev. Cheers, Kev. Yeah, I do talk about the double jab all the time, but man, it is so useful because it's so immediately in the opponent's range, as in it's out there on the front of your stance, and they don't know whether you're actually trying to hit them with it or if you're trying to pull up short so that you can come in behind it. You can hide your feet shuffling in underneath it. It's so important. I think every MMA gym in the world should not just be having people double jab on pads, but they should have them drilling the double jab as using it in different ways. And the knee raise to jab too, gliding in behind the fake teep and jabbing after that. Those 2 ways of making distance and getting the guy moving, they're so important. Especially when you spar people who are a little bit better than you at keeping the range. It's so frustrating. And it's very tempting to either sit back and be like, come on, come to me. And then they don't. Or you go oh, I'm so angry, and you throw shit punches from miles out and you end up in a worse position because they tag you with counters. The moment you start incorporating the double jab, they're suddenly moving because they've been moving to deal with your other strikes. If you don't give away as much on your strikes and you're still making the move, you've got something back there. And if you can get them moving reliably without really opening up that much, you can start moving them towards the fence, and then suddenly all that slickness is in danger of going away. And you can start throwing real stuff at them. I mean, the thing that I'd liken it to in other combat sports, or grappling sports would be a great example, grip breaking. Very easy to get distracted from it, get away from it, but you can go against better people than you in jiu-jitsu, in no-gi, in wrestling. And if you focus on taking their grips off whenever they get them, you're instantly going to do better than if you're focused on how do I get my favorite grips? How do I get into my knee slice where I dive at the guy? And then you're like, oh, hang on, he's holding that. I can't get there. If you instead say, no grips for you, mate. They're in a constant state of like, oh, I can't get the grips. Maybe less so in judo. In jiu-jitsu, like if you've got a guy underneath, if you've got a guy on the bottom who wants to play some guard, start taking off his grips. He's spending more time with no attachments and he's under pressure and he's concerned about it. And you're chilling. Cheers, Kev. Hello, Jack Slack, or as known in Chinese MMA community, the Fighting Pen. Did not know that. That's awesome. The last 2 years in Thailand, I have been working as Zhang Weili's team manager of daily needs. I do the laundry, drive the team around, and cook food when they are doing camp in Thailand. And my friend Olivia takes over the role when the team goes to the US, mainly so the team can focus on training and studying Weili's opponents. I'm curious about your opinion of Weili's eagerness to learn not just from different coaches, but her past opponents as well. One of the things she told me is that she loves to learn tactics and strategies that her opponents have successfully done to her. For example, we had Joanna over for dinner, and one of the things Weili was excited about, besides meeting up with an old rival, but now friend, was learning Joanna's ability to diffuse pressure and ring awareness. This is something her film scout Ghost shout out to the boy Ghost, has emphasized when she's not in camp, learning the tactics that have worked on Weili in the past and using them on her future opponents, like Rose Namajunas' positioning and footwork, Carla Esparza's grappling, not an opponent but sparring partner of Weili, Loma Lookboonmee's clinch striking, and also Leon Edwards' clinch positioning and breaking with elbows tekkers. I love the idea that the word tekkers is catching on in China. Also, our team is beyond humbled that you've chosen Weili for the Slacky Game Plan of the Year. It's truly an honour that you would recognise Weili for such an achievement. So on behalf of Team Weili, thank you very much for the analytical work that you do that inspires all of us to work hard and study the great sport of MMA. From your girl, Zenny. I can't get over tekkers in China. Love it. I think this is a great... one of the things that I really do appreciate about Zhang is that attitude of constantly improving, because she was not much of a wrestler to start with in her MMA, in her UFC run, that is. And it's become one of the strengths of her game to the point that anytime she fights a dangerous striker, we go, well, she'll probably just take her down. She's the better rounded fighter. And it is an interesting, I think this is it. I don't have the correct answer for you. It's always a balancing act. It's just like I've been moaning about boxing, taking their prospects and feeding them up on loads of not good fighters so that they can then fight good fighters. It's like, how do you apply your time? It's like Persona 5. It's like a dating sim. Now, you've only got so much time in the day. This is what we're all struggling with any pursuit in life. You've only got so much time in the day. It's always the opportunity cost of what you didn't do. Whenever you do something, you're committing to that and you're losing time doing other things. So I can understand why people don't do it. It probably seems like the safer thing to not try new things and not experiment. I just mentioned Max Holloway doing 2 years, 8 fights, southpaw. Fighting southpaw because he'd been working it in the gym and he wanted to actually do it. There's so many people work things in the gym. So much of what people do in the gym doesn't make it into the fights, and they end up just reinforcing the few things that they do that they are comfortable with. I see fighters in the gym on the mitts working stuff specifically for fights, and then you watch the fight and they don't do it at all. It's so hard to not just learn something in terms of like the muscle memory and even being confident enough to do it in sparring once you're under the bright lights, once money's on the line, once your career's on the line, because every loss affects your career. It's very hard to do new things. And it's tough because for every example I can give you of like a Zhang Weili or a Max Holloway or a Robert Whittaker or someone who grows from fight or has done some amazing growing from fight to fight and added new things to their game, there are probably a lot of guys who had a loss at a critical time in their career and they feel like it's because they got away from who they are and they got away from what they know best. And I think this is, I'm always going to be biased towards learning new things, trying new things, being a switch hitter, learning to pass guard off both sides. I'm always in favor of more, and fighting is often a case of falling back on what you know, and that's less. And I think I've said it before, but like me personally, in my own training, it's like I'm always trying to do new things, but it's always the handful of things when I'm tired or when it's someone really good, when it's someone you can't just arse around with. It's like you're back to the same, play the shit that works, play the hits. So to be able to be Bob Dylan and go out and say, I'm not playing the hits, I'm Southpaw today, or I'm not playing the hits, I'm wrestling today, in a world title fight or some shit like that, hats off to them. But again, I can't say it's for everyone. It's this, I think more than that, it's like, it's not just trying to round out your game, but I said this at the end of the Max Holloway article. A lot of people come in with a talent to the UFC, that is. They come in with a talent and they work to shore up the weaknesses. The hard thing is coming in with a talent and learning new shit while you're being watched by the whole world, or the whole world that cares about fights, and they're all picking you apart in the film room going, yeah, he does that, and that's, shouldn't be bringing out that southpaw stance. He's a bit shit from it still. Anyway, I can't remember what the question was, but I rambled for a while there. How long have we gone today? Man, I got an hour. Let's call it a day there. If you haven't read the Max Holloway article, and you're a Patreon boy, go read it. If you're not a Patreon boy, you're missing out on the Max Holloway article. What you're doing? It's going to be a series. It's called the Max Holloway Master Study. I've got a few different subjects I want to touch on. I think I might do his Southpaw era next, or his Southpaw period, his experimental period. I did back kicks to start with because I just thought that'd be fun. And also it had the funny link to the DC stuff about him not really knowing how to back kick until 2 fights ago. It's like, there are clips of him doing it 4 times and hitting Bermudez in the head every time in 2013 or whatever. But yes, go read that article. It's a pretty good one, I think. I'll be back for the Boycast later in the week with UFC 302, which I looked at the first time and I went, feel like that should be better. Because we're at the stage where everyone goes, well, we expect a stacked pay-per-view because the Apex cards are so bad. But then I looked at it again and I'm like, they're all pretty good fighters and they are all people we know. So I think it's one of those ones with a main event that's just sort of like meh to me. It'd be amazing if Dustin wins, but I expect him to just back himself onto the fence like he did against Khabib. It was like, I'm going to walk straight backwards now. Oh no, what's happened? Or jump a ghillie, that's the other thing everyone expects. So yeah, there's stuff to talk about on that I'm excited about. And there's some more boxing, some more kickboxing. So yeah, Boycast will be fun. And if you want to send an email to the podcast, as I've answered some today, there's space in the old inbox. I've taken some out. jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. And you can see what I'm writing at fightprimer.com. I'm your boy, Jack Slack. Gegard Mousasi's future endeavours bless.